I'm Neil Bennett. I'm one of the vice chairs of the London Society, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this talk tonight. Edney will be talking about the fabric of London, which is basically an introduction to the materials from which London is made. And I'm very much looking forward to his talk. I mean, fabric is a slightly strange word, perhaps. I mean, we're the London Society. We're interested not only in the people who make the kind of city, but also the physical reality of it and how it stands up. You know, how, the materials that actually make it work. This is a taster, if you like, to a planned engineering and infrastructure school. Some of you may know, and this is one of the benefits of being a society member, is that we've had previous and very successful planning and architecture schools, which are a sequence of lectures normally held on a Saturday morning. And we hope when times get back to normal, that we will have an engineering and infrastructure school. And hopefully that will be in June next year. By all means, join to get to the society to get details and to get advance warning of that. Go to our website, you can see that. Now tonight's talk is by Edney Ndumbe of Elliott Wood. Elliott Wood are structural and civil engineers. They've been practicing for about 20 years. I see from their website that they boast of having a wide variety of accomplishments, from road bridges to Burning Men, and from medieval chateau through to 2020 award-winning projects. So sort of the entire range of medieval to modern and across the range of building types. They've done a lot of work on Lincoln Cathedral as an example. They were the engineers for the Lord's Cricket Ground Media Centre, which is the big white pod thing at one end of the cricket ground. And engineers are quite often, as you'll hear from Edney, they're hidden heroes who actually make things stand up. So whether you like that media centre or not, Elliott Woods were the heroes who made it stand up. And then the final example I'd cite from Elliott Wood is that they were responsible for the engineering of the innovative proposed Rotherhithe pedestrian and cycle bridge from Rotherhithe over to Canary Wharf. As all bridges across the Thames, that's going through a convoluted story, but again, look at Elliott Wood's website if you wish to see further details of any of those projects, including the Rotherhithe Bridge. Now, Edney will tell us more about this, I'm sure, but Edney got into architectural engineering and then got drawn towards structural engineering. And he's an associate director at Elliott Wood. He works on a wide range of things, from historic projects, including Fulham Palace, through to modern projects. And at that point, I will step aside and let Edney talk to you for about 30 minutes. I should just say, before I go, that tonight is a webinar. And so if you wish to ask a question, and I will collate them and read them out at the end, please do so through the Q&A button on the bottom bar of the software, of the Zoom thing. It's in the bottom right in the middle of my own Zoom thing. So Edney will talk for about 30 minutes. As you go through the presentation, please do record your questions, and I will see you again at the end of Edney's talk. Over to you, Edney.
Thank you, Neil. Just share my screen. Right, tonight's talk is about the fabric of London, and you should be able to see a contents screen. Essentially, I'll go very briefly through a history of building materials, and then we'll do a whistle-stop tour of London through the ages and the different materials that have been used to build London. Now, building materials, I've tried to separate them into what I call building blocks. These are essentially the materials that we use in a combination of ways to build, to scale up. So I've got on the left-hand side some stone, which is natural, and timber, and then everything else is pretty much man-made. So we've got some natural materials, and the man-made materials would be bricks, steel, concrete, and you can see some tiles on the right-hand side. Those are all man-made materials. Now, with these materials, you've got to join them together in some way to scale up. So I've got here a series of photographs of different types of joining things, as I'd call them. So long time ago, we had wooden dowels and pegs, which we still use today for timber buildings or for even making furniture. They're very strong connections, and especially when you're joining timber to timber. We then have nails, which we invented about 3,400 BC. And then we moved on to screws, which started life as wooden screws, but we were able to have metal screws subsequently, especially in Europe, around about the 15th century. Nuts and bolts came into their own in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, when we could mass produce these. Then we get on to fancy bolts. Say the roll bolts is a bolt that you use to join, say, steel to concrete. So you drill a hole in the concrete and you put the bolt in and you tighten it, and it works by friction. And that was around about the 1930s when that was invented. And in the 1960s, chemical anchors, which essentially are bolts which are glued into materials, were invented. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see glues. I've got some Pritt stick there just to show that we do use glues in modern buildings. At the moment, we use them to glue glass onto aluminium frames. We also use lime to join things. So the previous slide, you saw some bricks forming brickwork. Now the joints are formed from lime mortar, which is just lime mixed with sand. Now, there is a reason why certain materials are used in London, and it's mainly to do with the geology of London. So London lies on the floodplain of the River Thames, and over the years, the river's deposited an interesting array of different minerals in the ground. So we have so towards the eastern side, we have what you see on the screen in yellow on the right-hand image are beds of what we call brick earth, which give you the classic yellow London stock brick. It's a natural mix of sand, silt, and clay, which is perfect for making bricks. And below London is just clay soil, and it's pretty good for making bricks, which is why you find a lot of bricks in London, in buildings in London. We also then get stone from places like Kent, and in Dorset, Portland stone from near Weymouth. So these are some of the materials that have been used to build London. You tend not to see timber these days because the forests have all been cut down. But a long time ago, the native forests were used for buildings around London. More recently, we import timber from Scandinavia and other European countries or North America. Now, building materials are used because we want to, or we have access to energy or for transportation to bring materials from different parts. So the fact that we've got the River Thames means that you can actually bring in materials up the river from anywhere in the world, pretty much, into London. When the Romans left, they gave us a very good network of roads, which we still use, which all lead to London, and they're used to bring building materials from all over the country. One of the key things with building materials is energy, where you get your energy from, especially when you're mass manufacturing. So electricity and the source of electricity becomes important, especially for things like aluminium, or these days for smelting metal, steel. We also have other energy sources like coal, which were used during the Industrial Revolution to power kilns for brick making, etc. We use the canals and the river to bring in timber, stones, plaster, sand. So lots of materials are transported into London. And the wealth of London as a trading center allows set very good quality buildings to be built in London. Now, those are some of the factors that influence the materials that you find in London. Now, I'll go through the different ages of London, which I've sort of divided into some fairly broad architectural historic categories. So we start off with Roman London, which goes back to 400 BC and before that, when the Romans came into England, and the Romans were very good engineers. They'd built Rome, they'd built roads across the Roman Empire. So when they came into London, they brought the skills of brick making, tile making, just building in plaster, in mortar, with stones, joining materials, scaling up. So you can see some photographs of the old London Wall, the Roman Wall, which there's the very good remains near Tower Hill, and there's another stretch near London Wall, Salters Gardens in the city. You can see in the photograph that they've used stone with mortar to join the stones to form the mass of the wall. And the stone is believed to come from Kentish ragstone that's been used in London Wall from various tests that have been done. Now, Roman London only occupied the city of London as we now know it, which is about a square mile, and it had a population of about 45,000. Fairly prosperous. There was a bridge across into Southwark, the London Bridge, which lasted for a period of time. Now, when the Romans left, London was essentially abandoned because the Saxons couldn't keep control of it, couldn't maintain they didn't have the expertise to maintain the walls, the defenses. So London became a dispersed city, what we know now as Greater London. So essentially the Saxons, instead of occupying one central area, dispersed themselves into farmstead all around London. Now, there's not a lot of Saxon London left. There is an arch in the church, which is the oldest church in the city, which is All Hallows by the Tower. There's a Saxon arch there. Other than that, there isn't much of Saxon London. The one thing they left us, for sure, were names of places, especially around London. So when you hear places which end with Hampton, Whitworth, you know that those are Saxon farmsteads where they settled when they abandoned London. So the Normans turned up and brought new skills into London, but a lot of the Norman buildings were built from stone. I've got some examples here, and they're not your usual examples, but they're certainly worth visiting. On the left-hand side, you will see Great St. Bart's, which is the Reformation, and there's not a lot of it, of the main church hall left. So it's certainly well worth a visit. On the right hand, you'll see St. Olave in the city. It's not far from Tower Hill, and it's built round about the 1300s. There's not the bit that you can see from the street is a newer part of the church. The older part, the medieval part is below in the crypt, which you'd have to go down to have a look at. Around this time, London had a population of about 75,000. Then we move on to the next period, which is Tudor, which I've kept quite, like I say, I've used some broad architectural periods just to make some sense of the buildings that were being built. Now, the Tudors used bricks for their really good quality buildings. And I've got some examples here. One is Fulham Palace, which is a Tudor building. And the example below is Whitehall Museum in Cheam down in South London, which is actually a timber frame building. And it's one of the last remaining good quality timber frame buildings from the Tudor times. The Fulham Palace, the bricks from Fulham Palace, at the time, so when the previous period, a lot of bricks were in use because the skills had gone from London. So the Flemish and the Dutch came over around the time when the dissolution of the monasteries happened, when Henry VIII took over the properties from the church. And so a lot of bricklayers or craftsmen came from Flanders to start making bricks in London. And so a lot of brickwork was being used around about this time in London. Later on, around the 1600s, we had the Great Fire of London in 1666, and a lot of the timber frame buildings in the city were destroyed by the fire. So what then happened after that, they started building brick party walls and lots of buildings in brickwork. And that really kicked off the use of bricks in London as the main construction material, because of course a brick building doesn't burn as badly as a timber frame building. So round about the end of the Tudor period, we have a population in London of about 200,000. So it is expanding. It's expanding westwards towards Westminster and south across the river into Southwark. The next period I've used is Georgian London, and I've used less well-known examples to illustrate some of the gems that you have around London. So this is High Road in Tottenham. It's right beside Tottenham Hotspur's stadium, and it's a beautiful Georgian terrace that you find if you go and have a look at it, which is still in fairly good condition. And I know that we have been looking at some of these buildings to repair them more recently. So if you do have a chance, it's well worth a visit to have a look. The Georgians used lots of London stocks in their buildings because, of course, we have the clay from London. The red bricks that you see are from clay that's been imported into London. They're called red rubbers. And I'll come on to that later on, London's traditional color is more of that yellow stock. It does vary a bit because, of course, the beds of brick earth, the yellowy sandy silty clay, they vary from one part to the other. So you do get a variation of colors in the bricks in London. So I've got another slide of a couple of Georgian buildings, one of which is the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, which is currently undergoing refurbishment and will become the headquarters for Tower Hamlets Council. And on the left, I've got a Doughty House in Richmond, which is a Georgian mansion. And you can see how the Georgians were now importing, with the wealth from trading, they were importing materials from all over the world. So we've got a really nicely tiled floor, which you can see on the left-hand side. They used stone and stucco or render in their buildings quite a bit. Then with industrial revolution and the mass exodus from the countryside into the city, London expands hugely, and there's essentially a building boom which happens during the Victorian time. So at the end of the Georgian period, we have a population of about 2 million, and by the end of the 19th century, London's population has ballooned to 6 million. Now this creates a need to build a lot of housing. And London is not a huge city. So, and land is expensive. And, you know, the terrace housing was a very good way of building scaling up your buildings without taking up too much land. It's surprising how dense terrace housing can be. So there's on the left-hand side, you'll see St. John's Church Road in Hackney, which is a lovely terrace in Hackney. It's in a conservation area. You can see the yellow stocks that they've used there. And the early Victorian buildings would have had the yellow stocks. Later ones, not so much, because they were importing and making bricks cheaper in the Midlands. So a lot of bricks were being imported, which were different colors, reds. So the color of London also changes depending on the time that it was being built. I've got an example of the use of metals, and we've got Hammersmith Bridge, which is built from wrought iron. Now, because of the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, we were able to start making better irons. We hadn't quite got to the point where we were making steels, but we were making better irons and malleable irons that you could beat into shapes. And so this is a wrought iron bridge, which is still it's been undergoing repairs for a long time, but it's certainly well worth a visit. It was built by Joseph Bazalgette, late 1800s. So we're ending the Victorian period with a population of about 6 million. There's an emphasis in education, and you can see I've got an example of a Victorian school. There are lots of Victorian schools in London. Everywhere you go, you'll find one, and they're all beautifully built. A lot of them are no longer used as schools, but this one certainly is still a school in Hackney. It was built by the London School Board. So education became a main focus towards the end. Health and education, well-being, towards the end of this Victorian period. So we then move on to the 20th century, which I've split into two periods, the pre-war and post-war. Now, towards right at the end of the 19th century, we had worked out how to make steel from iron. And steel is just, it's an alloy of iron, which has a few more minerals in it and some carbon, and it makes it a lot stronger. It doesn't break as easily. And we've started using steel in buildings. So the two buildings on the left one and the middle one, the old War Office, looks traditional, looks like it's built from bricks, but it's actually a steel frame building. It still has a lot of bricks in it, which I believe that as well as Battersea Power Station has got probably the most number of bricks in a building, in a single building in London. Then we've got 55 Broadway, which it used to be the old headquarters for London Transport, and it's situated above St. James's Park Station. TfL used to TfL. They moved out of there last year, I believe. And it's situated above St. James's Park Station, and it's called London's first skyscraper. So we now learned from the Americans, and we were building tall. This is it's a steel frame building. Doesn't quite look like it when you look at it from the outside, but it's got steel columns and beams which hold it up. And then on the left-hand side, I've got an example of a warehouse building built from concrete in the 1930s. an Art Deco style building, Bankstock buildings. It's in Hackney. So you'll find that during the pre-war, most of these main buildings in London were built from steel as a structural framing system, with brickwork, cladding, or stone, depending on how impressive the building needed to be. Post-war London, things are slightly different, and I've got on the right-hand side, the middle peak image and the right-hand side image is of tower block which was in Newham called Ronan Point, which so after the war, there's a shortage of housing, lots of buildings have been bombed, we had to build quick, so we built quick. And this is a concrete building made with precast concrete, which following a gas explosion partly collapsed and changed the way we design these buildings, these tower blocks, and how they become more resilient and more robust to accidents. So it's just a good example of a concrete building that we didn't quite get right at the time, but that problem has been resolved. I know we have some other issues going forward, but that's, those are some of the challenges that you find when you build these buildings. On the left-hand side, I've got Salters Hall, which is a concrete frame building in the city, 1960s, late 1960s design along the brutalist tradition, but beautifully detailed. That it's a listed building, Salters Hall. I think in the foreground, you can see the old Roman wall. So we're now looking at marrying old and new as part of making spaces in London. At the end of the 20th century, London's population has grown by another 1 million, I think. So we are up to now 7 million from the 6 million. So not massively, not the same as in the 19th century, but it's certainly been some growth. But there has been a need to reconstruct London. So when you go around the city, you'll find lots and lots of concrete buildings, some steel frame, but a lot of them will be concrete because concrete was deemed much cheaper to build with after the war, just because of a shortage of steel. The steel had been used to build armaments, so there was a shortage. The other thing you'll find is the increased use of glass and aluminium in these buildings. So aluminium is made from, you need electricity basically from the oxide. You need electricity to produce aluminium, and before, up until the 20th century, we hadn't quite managed to mass produce electricity. So once we were able to do that, we can make aluminium, which is light, strong, and we use it for framing windows. So to create these big glazed elevations, you have aluminium. And towards the end of the 20th century, we're now using plastics. So we all have, along any street you go down, you'll find some UPVC windows, which are just plastic, extruded plastic. So plastics are becoming part of the building fabric that we use. So we then move on to the 21st century, which is towards the end of the talk. And we're now using, we haven't really changed from what we're using in the 20th century because the materials haven't changed. We're using steel, we're using glass, concrete, bricks are having a comeback because we quite like them. And the focus is more on creating nice spaces, exposing. So we try not to hide the structure that we're using, and we try to make the structure part of the architecture. So unlike at the start of the 20th century, when the buildings looked like they were a completely different form of construction, 21st century buildings, we're trying to explore and create these spaces. We're using more sustainable materials. We are creating light, airy spaces, lots of glass being used, and that's still carrying on. And so conservation, energy conservation is becoming more of a key thing as we go through the 21st century. And then looking beyond, we we've spent a lot of time now looking at older buildings, and in some ways we're trying to, we now have a much better understanding of why the older buildings work. Why is it that brickwork buildings built in the Georgian times and the Victorian times are more flexible in terms of their usage, more adaptable? Why do they create better spaces? So that understanding is now helping us to go forward and try and keep these buildings as best as we can. One of the key things about sustainability is about not really building new. If you can reuse the old, you save a huge amount of energy. And we know now that, you know, we have to look after the environment. So the reuse of buildings is becoming more and more an important thing, and therefore the repair of these buildings and how these materials work carries on being more important. We are now creating better spaces, stitching in old and new, trying to use more timber from sustainable sources. So I've got on the bottom right, the Horniman Museum Education building, which is just made from glue laminated timbers, just to give you that nice airy space. Children come in there to have lectures about artifacts in the Horniman Museum. Great James's Street is just a workspace that's been created that's lovely to work in. You know, well-being is quite important. And in the middle is it's a photograph of a doorway that we tried to honestly restore and repair at Fulham Palace by inserting a single timber beam and a single timber post and just stitching in and tidying up the other brickwork and the plaster, just so that people using the doorway can understand what lies behind the finishes. So we're being more honest with the materials and just creating nicer spaces, being more careful with resources and what we do with the building going forward. So that's where I end the talk.
Hi, Edney. Thank you very much indeed for that. First, could you just quickly explain the Building Society, which we quickly saw on our screens? I know it is, but perhaps you could tell us what that is, and it'd be of interest to our viewers, I think.
Yes, the Building Society is it's a collaborative workspace that is in London. So Elliott Wood, we've been looking at ways to as to say, engineer a better society, bring like-minded people together. So the Building Society, we've created this the shared workspace, which has a whole range of different professionals who are able to come and collaborate, exchange ideas. So it's based in Good Street, on Whitfield Street, at the moment, and yeah, so we try and provide learning programs as well, so that we can share knowledge, we can have debates and discussions about topical issues, and just trying to sort of look forward in a more positive way, how we don't damage the environment or our world. We have to look after our world going forward. And it's one of the core things.
That really cues some of the questions, and I would encourage everybody to ask questions, and maybe as we go along with the debate tonight, we were going to have the engineering school until recent events actually at the Building Society. It's a good location. It's a good place. It's a certainly very intriguing place to go to. So I'd recommend that when you can go there, that's please do make a visit to the Building Society. What I was going to do is to start with perhaps sort of a look forward, Edney, talking about new materials, and then perhaps go backwards and just in some ways and just start talking about sustainability and conservation. I mean, we've seen, from your slides how generally buildings have benefited I suppose, from materials getting thinner and more efficient at what they do. What are some of the things that you think are most exciting, sort of things and new materials to look forward in the future, and how might we use them?
I think glues are coming into their own in a lot of ways. Carbon fiber, we now use carbon fiber, for example, to strengthen old concrete buildings that don't have enough capacity to take loads. So we're using those. Glass, certainly glass is the use of glass as a structure. Big elevations is coming into its own again in the 21st century. But I think it's more about creating spaces where us humans feel comfortable in. The focus seems to be changing, and placemaking is becoming more important because it's all to do with our well-being, which is why we've almost been looking back at why some of the older buildings and why are they nicer to be in? Why do they feel better? And so the use of, say, lime in buildings is becoming more and more popular, because lime allows your building to breathe. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, so it creates a better environment. It's porous. It moderates moisture in a building. So it's almost, we have a better understanding of how things work, and we're now trying to use that to create nicer spaces that we as humans can live in. No. So I think for me that's probably the more interesting thing, how we're changing our outlook on how we go forward. So even though we've made some mistakes with some of the buildings of the 20th century, we don't necessarily have to pull them down. We can change them a bit, keep them, because there's a lot of energy stored in these buildings that you don't want to waste. So if you can adapt them, then it's a more sustainable way to go forward. So we have to be a bit more creative about how we use the buildings.
Yes, I mean, there was some interesting research done about 20 years ago, which was observing that in terms of the cost of buildings, in particular in London, that if the capital cost of a building was one, you'd spend probably over its lifetime 10 times as much maintaining that, but you'd actually spend 200 times that on the people who actually were in there. So that was one sort of set of things, which is basically saying don't worry so much about first cost. Now, I don't have my facts and figures to compare that now, but I don't know whether you have any view on the balance between the embedded energy in building materials, and this is sort of going towards our conservation sort of point, and the balance between that and how expensive it is to kind of run buildings. But I mean, people are making the point more and more now that we should build buildings in a way that we can dismantle them and use those bits and pieces in new buildings because of the huge amount of embedded energy that's in material. And you mentioned that aluminium, for instance, which is a huge consumer of
energy. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yes, I might use a good example, the humble brick. The humble brick fits into your hand, and bricks are they don't have a massive amount of energy density compared to something like concrete. And actually, you can work out the energy density of materials by the strength of the materials, because the energy is converted into chemical bonds in the actual physical properties of the material. So the stronger the material, the more energy has gone into making that material. So stones, for example, with all of the geological energy that's gone into them, are pretty strong, but they're quite difficult for us to mine and build with, and they're very unwieldy. So I always go back to the humble brick because it's probably our greatest invention, in terms of building materials, because it's small enough for you to carry in one hand, and you can scale it up into anything as long as you're sensible about how you build it. How you build whatever it is that you're building. If you look at something like concrete, the issue with concrete is more to do with the cement, how you make the cement, because to make Portland cement, you have to putting a lot of energy into, mixing the materials and burning the materials. And that's probably what makes concrete not so sustainable. However, if you don't pull down the concrete building, and once you build it, you look after it for the lifetime of the building and beyond, then it's not so bad in terms of sustainability. Timber is great. It grows all around us, and we should grow more forests. We've cut down lots of forests. We need to grow forests. But timber is probably, because we can grow the timber, it's probably the most sustainable material we have because we can actually grow it. But the problem with timber is that we've cut down a lot of forests, and it takes a long time for good timber to grow. So you've got to plan well ahead to grow your forest and then to harvest the timber and use in the buildings. So I think, I'm more of a fan of reusing materials as best as you can. Steel, you can reuse steel. Aluminium, sometimes you can recycle aluminium. It tends to be, you recycle downwards, so the quality goes down as you recycle it. But you can recycle aluminium easily. Timber, you can recycle sensibly. The problem with bricks is more to do with how you build them. So when we build bricks with lime mortar, you can actually take the bricks apart because the lime mortar isn't very hard. But when you build bricks with cement mortar, the cement mortar is actually harder than the bricks. So you can't take the bricks apart. So you then end up knocking down the entire wall and turning it into rubble, which is a waste. So actually, we should probably be thinking about building more in lime mortar that you can carefully dismantle, a softer mortar that you can dismantle and reuse the material without wasting it, which is what used to happen. Those churches in the city that were pulled down after the dissolution of the monasteries, the stones were taken away and used elsewhere. In the Tower of London, you've got timber in the floor, which came from the ships that were they used to invade England, the Norman ships. So the timber, the masts were used in the floor to make floor beams. So there are ways, if you don't have that, you can actually recycle a lot of materials in buildings. We just need to be a bit clever about it, I think.
Well, that perhaps answers one of the questions that we had sort of come in. I would encourage more questions from you all, but in terms of which materials you'd recommend, clearly things like timber, and then I think the reduce, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle sort of virtuous circle, I think, applies very strongly here, and clearly we can use aluminium. Apart from that, we should be recycling that. I can't resist talking. I didn't realise for a long time why dustbin men were called dustbin men. And forgive me for a second here, but apparently in Victorian times, household dust and ash was actually quite a valuable thing, and was collected house to house by the dustbin men. Now, I never knew what the use of this dust was. And apparently what happened, it went up to Bedfordshire into London Pletton bricks and was used as the firing power.
The firing, yep.
So that's a lovely example of a simple, albeit labour-intensive system of recycling what you have. So you were burning wood or perhaps coal, but then the ash was reused to actually burn the clay to fire the bricks. Now, there's probably a sort of open question, perhaps, but so we've also got another question coming about, isn't it more efficient to repair old buildings rather than to create new ones? Clearly, that I've opened a very open question there, but I mean, from your experience, do you have a preference, or?
I like to repair, because it's so wasteful. Personally, it's very wasteful to knock down and rebuild. So if we can repair, I think it's how creative we can be with what we do. And that's where this is a challenge to architects and engineers to be a bit more creative about repairing and reuse. Because if you go, I mean, I did a walk last week around the city with my tourist eyes on. And it's quite interesting how we've managed to mix in. There are a few good examples of old and new mixed, where we're repairing the old, we're stitching in the new, and it's all very sympathetic and fits in nicely. So I think the more we do that, the better, because we have to be honest about what's happened in the past and respect that. And where we can add new things, then if we have to, then fine. But really, it's not, I think the days when we would pull down and rebuild, we need to rethink that approach. It's not really sustainable. It's not sustainable. So.
Okay, I mean, I think there's a bit of a debate there, because the city is an interesting example where, I don't know what the proportion is, but there are a lot of new buildings, and a lot of the buildings tend to get torn down at the end of their occupational leases. Now, I was struck, I live myself in a Victorian terraced house, and it's been cut and carved quite a lot, and I think it was built in such a way that it had, and the phrase is a long life, well, loose fit, long life. And I mean, do you think there is a way of us building more loosely for a kind of longer life, maybe in terms of use? I mean, it was interesting looking at that row of Georgian terraces in Tottenham that had been cut and carved a lot. You know, there was a vehicle hole knocked through one of them. I'm sure one of them was an office. One of them was a tea shop. Another one, somebody was still living in. One was flats. One wasn't.
Yeah, the 3 Points Cafe.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a sort of comment on that? How do we get to that to that sort of situation of having buildings up there for longer?
So the great thing about those buildings, especially during the Georgian ones and the Victorian ones, is that the building structure itself is quite simple. Building structures tend to be getting your structure right is hugely important, of course, to make sure that the building stands up. But they were built simply from bricks and timber in a very simple way, creating fairly large open spaces, which we now subdivide. We can turn them into flats, we can unpick them and turn them back into houses. And the materials that are used are simple enough for the average good builder to work on. It's not a specialist thing. So that makes it hugely sustainable. That's why we still like them. That's why we still have them. And going forward, I don't think we're there yet, but we need to think about the spaces that we build. I see that there are lots of buildings going up which don't seem that flexible, because what we don't know is how our lifestyles will change. In fact, in the last 4 or 5 months, things have changed drastically. You know, we're now all working from home. Suddenly you need a bit more, you need a separate space at home to work in. And if you live in one of those much smaller properties, it becomes quite difficult to create that separation if you have to. So we do, at the moment we're not, but we do need to think about it. And it's one of the debates going forward that we need to try and build more flexible, more adaptable buildings. So you'll find them a bit more open, so you can use them for different things, because our lifestyles change all the time.
But won't a developer or a householder or the person who's paying for this say it's going to cost me more money?
That's the eternal debate, isn't it?
There's the balance, folks. There's the issue. I should say that I'm an architect, and I can tell you that developer friends do occasionally say things.
Yeah, it's all about pounds per square foot, and don't I understand it? Yeah, I think it's
got a further question in about the use of plastics. That there's I'm not entirely sure you can recycle UPVC windows, for instance, and I think most plastics are quite difficult to recycle sensibly for a good kind of use. I mean, in my life, I've got a good number of sash windows, which, depending when they were built, they're good and less good timber. My parents always said to me, "Why don't you replace them with UPVC? You'll never have to paint them again." So, what's the answer to that one? What do we do about? How can we use other materials than plastic? Do you think?
It's cost, isn't it? Because a good window is made from hardwood, which it's not that readily available these days. The issue with UPVC is that you can mass produce it, and they're fairly durable now, but they're not that easy to recycle. So I think it's really what we do with the UPVC once that window system gets to the end of its life, because they don't last as long as the timber windows that we have. It's not, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's how you recycle it and how you reuse it. And we're finding more and more new ways of reusing plastics and recycling plastics. You know, there's talk about embedding plastics in concrete when you build some of these buildings, you know, because they can make the concrete lighter. You know, so there are lots of different thoughts that are going around, because of course the whole environment seems to be covered in plastics, which is not so good for our health and well-being.
Right.
So I think it's really down to how we recycle the UPVC, how we reuse it if we can. My preference is for timber, but then it's a personal preference, and I don't think not everyone has that ability to, because timber windows are very expensive now. But I'd sooner paint my timber windows than.
Well, okay. Well, maybe you talk offline about that one. Now, you had to, in your talk, which commendably you finished on time, you had to whiz through 2 millennia and the entire history of London in 25 minutes. And clearly you weren't able to talk about all types of material. Now, there's some softer things, and I'm very much aware you're a strut engineer, such as insulation materials. I mean, do you have any comment on how they're changing and what's kind of best into use now? Are there any materials like that which are plain bad, or are there any ones that you think will be coming forward in the future which we should be using? I mean, clearly, in the time that I've been designing buildings, the size of the insulation you've had to use has gone from nothing in a cavity wall to being that much. So
yeah,
it's not changing. But I mean, I'd really love my cavity walls to be that wide still. So, any comment on them?
Yeah, so I mean, we had the problem is we've had all these wonderful materials that have turned out to be bad for us. You know, I remember the days of asbestos, and that was such a wonderful material used for insulation, fireproofing, bad for you now. And we now have the issue of some of the insulation that we use. More recently, for example, the panels in the Grenfell Tower that caught fire. So I think we need to rethink. There's a whole exercise to rethink the sustainable insulation. We need to insulate the buildings so that we can conserve energy, but we also need to allow the buildings to breathe so we can live in them healthily. And I know there's lamb's wool insulation. There's lots of natural materials that are coming into their own. So I think we're at an early stage in terms of new types of insulation that can be used. Rock wool is a very popular one at the moment because it's seen better than Celotex. The Celotex, the fancy material, is at the moment it's still the best insulation we have.
Plastic-based foam type thing, was it not?
It's a foam type, yeah, which is still the best of the insulating materials. But so we have to, and I'm sure we'll work out a way of using more natural materials or designing the buildings differently. Because I think the more we apply our brain, it's all about how creative we can be with it. We can achieve great things if we think about them properly, and that for me is the solution. We haven't got there yet. We need to think about it more and find better ways.
Okay. Now we're getting on towards 7:30, so I would encourage the audience to put in any final questions that you've got, and thank you for that next question. one thing that always greatly amused and inspired me is over mankind, there's been this drive to compete, and the people building Gothic cathedrals would keep making them taller and thinner out of less material to be better than their kind of neighbours, until they actually fell over. So we had, I think, Amiens Cathedral's spire fell down, and I think Lincoln Cathedral also went a kind of wee bit too far. So that one can see almost today here in London that there's a competition between sort of tall buildings and how people can make the most efficient buildings. But what really inspires you as an engineer? What are you trying to make better? I mean, what do you say to yourself when you say, "Oh, we could have done that a bit better on the next one"? What?
Well, yeah, as you said, it's a human condition: bigger, better, taller. It's just a human state of things, isn't it? For me, it's about creating spaces. I've always been, and that's probably one of the reasons why I went into engineering, because I wanted to be able to influence the spaces that I am in. Whether it's to do with the height of the space, or but just creating nice spaces. So I don't have a particular preference for tall buildings, big, wide buildings. It's more about the space that you create, because if you go around the world and you look at the most interesting buildings and the ones that people really love, it's the space that's been created. It's how the light works and the shadows. That's what makes it special. Or courtyards or piazzas. It is all about the space that we create. And so we need to, if you go into the city now, you can barely get sunlight down at ground level. Because there are lots of buildings there, and people want to build. They want to put more people up on the floors and have better views. So, but we have to think about the spaces inside and the spaces outside. And it's really that whole thing about thinking about the spaces and just looking after how we feel around those spaces. I think for me, that's more important than the heights of the building or how much glass you use. Okay, it's about the space.
Thank you. That was a really inspiring answer from you. I think at that point, we'll draw an end to the question and draw the session tonight to an end. And thank you very much indeed, Edney, for your talk and for your slides. And that's given us a whole set of buildings to go and look at in London. I had many of those examples I wasn't aware of, and the building in Cheam, for instance, and so on. So I'd encourage you all to go and look at the buildings, have a think about how they were made. The older ones tend to be clearer in how they're made, perhaps, and expose their bones, perhaps, and some more. So thank you again, Edney. Just remains for me to encourage you all again to join the London Society if you haven't already. We're going to take a breather in August, and there's one more event coming up before we break, which is on the 8th of August, which is a virtual tour, as we have to do these days, of public housing, Clerkenwell and Finsbury. And there's obviously a lot of interesting things there. There's the Lubecken blocks and so on. So that's coming up on the 8th of August. Then on the beginning of September, our first event there is Faith in the City of London. Now, I suspect that's one of those talks that sounds deadly dull, but is actually not going to be. And this is driven by the publication of a photographic book by Nikki Gorek. And I think it's looking at the City of London from a different point of view. I can see from our website that we're promising huge wet fish and also vicars wielding knives. So that's definitely one to watch and one to attend. And then there's a further V-tour coming up later in September around Finsbury Park and Stroud Green. So at that point, I'd thank you all for listening to us. I'd thank Edney again for his talk and the work in putting that together and the thinking. And say good night from myself and from the London Society. Thank you, Edney.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.